I consider it an honor, and I'm extremely humbled to be among so many scientists, since my degree is in economics, and I don't consider that a science. Sorry, economists. Well, it's a pretend science, but anyway, I'll give you that. And I want to thank Dr. Orient for finding me, and Jeremy for being so patient and making all the arrangements so timely to bring me here from Washington, D.C. And it's been a tremendous pleasure to be here, and I was really inspired today by all the presentations, and there will be quite a few articles coming soon, as soon as I get home and get some sleep. I was a college professor for 30 years, and I had to give up teaching, although now I have a much larger audience because I'm on radio all the time, sometimes on TV, and I speak. Most recently, I spoke in Switzerland. But I do have a larger audience, and one of the secret talents that I do have is that I can get in trouble in 5 or 6 different languages when I'm in Europe. And my husband trusts me so much that he even drives against the one-way street when I tell him it's okay. And he also puts premium gas in a diesel tank rental car. And of course, we ruined the car and we had to pay 300 euros to have it towed away, but that's okay. It was a nice experience. I came to the United States in 1978. I grew up in communist Romania, and I'm here because my daddy let his only child come to freedom. And unfortunately, he did not live to be at my graduation when, in 1989, he died a few months shy of Ceausescu's execution on Christmas '89. He was supposed to come to my PhD graduation, and he never made it. He died the day before. And he was a victim of communist goons. So it is because of that legacy that I am such a staunch anti-communist. And of course, I found Agenda 21, which is global communism. And I did not know much about Agenda 21. Obviously, I was blissfully unaware, but I was uncomfortable along the way, being in an academia dominated by Marxists. But I thought, well, maybe if I become a little more accommodating and if I can integrate a lot quicker, perhaps we won't have such differences of opinion at faculty meetings. But I became really interested in Agenda 21 in 2008 when I retired, and I moved to Washington, D.C., and I started seeing evidence from friends who were farmers who were finding themselves running into trouble with local government in reference to property rights. They couldn't farm, they were changing zoning rules, and this one word started popping up, a visioning committee and smart growth. And I thought, well, I have to investigate what is this smart growth and what's a visioning committee? And I found out that there was one in my county, Prince William County in Northern Virginia, which has actually brought Agenda 21 into our county. We have several Agenda 21 developments there. So pretty soon, being the smart cookie that I am, I found Agenda 21 everywhere, including the National Building Museum, where I actually went for fun. We have so many free museums in DC, and lo and behold, it was wall-to-wall, green growth, smart growth, comprehensive plan, Agenda 21, wall-to-wall, including the bookstore. So I started taking pictures as I visited the museum, and although it said no photographs, but I'm kind of a photographing nut. I don't follow rules very well if you tell me no. So I found out in this museum why we have such traffic in Northern Virginia and in DC in general. Back when they were trying to build the beltways, there were more plans for beltways, but they were actually stopped by community activists who riled up the people who had homes in the path of these beltways that were to be developed, and they told them that their properties were going to be stolen. So of course there was enough furor raised and the plans were scraped. So that's one reason we don't have enough alternative ways other than I-95, 495, and 395 in DC. And they're constantly busy 24/7. And to make matter worse, Agenda 21 now has developments to take us away from our cars through all these very, very expensive toll roads, and they have just turned the HOV into a toll road. And it's very, very expensive. We were talking on the bus yesterday and it was done so criminally, really, they never consulted taxpayers that they were doing it. It was just a deal between the politicians and Transurban, the company that made the improvements. Well, the idea that Agenda 21 is everywhere is true. I have spent hundreds and hundreds of hours reading documents that I didn't want to read, that made my skin crawl because it reminded me of communism that I had escaped after 20 years. And I found out that this idea of the New World Order that is promoting this global communism via Agenda 21 through environmentalism actually has been around since the turn of the 20th century. All you have to do is look at your dollar bill, if you have one in your pocket, and on the back, right under the Masonic pyramid, are the Latin words Novus Ordo Seclorum, which means the New World Order. And everybody's familiar with Cecil Rhodes, of the Rhodes Scholarship fame. He was probably one of the first that had dreamed up and believed that the entire world should be under one government, and who might that be? Of course, the British Empire. And he had an interesting organization in 1891 that was called the Society of the Elect, or the Secret Society. And later on, they turned it into the Chatham House Gang because they bought this residence called the Chatham House for their headquarters. And that was the beginning of the global governance idea, at least on the European soil. I'm not mentioning all the bankers, the Rockefellers, the Rothschilds, and so forth. Then there was an interesting guy named Colonel Edward Mandell House. He was Woodrow Wilson's advisor and chief negotiator for the Treaty of Versailles. He had a kind of following of like-minded individuals who formed a group that had a kind of a innocuous name, the Inquiry. This group met actually with the Chatham House Gang, and they decided to formalize their groups into the common goal of globalization of one world government. And the Chatham House Gang became what is today known as the Royal Institute for International Affairs, and the Inquiry Group in the United States became the Council on Foreign Relations, or CFR. President Roosevelt, about 2 weeks after Pearl Harbor, issued a, quote, Declaration of United Nations, which was the first time such a term was used in an American official document. And according to his son-in-law, Curtis B. Dell, he said, quote, most of his thoughts, meaning Roosevelt's, his political ammunition was carefully manufactured for him in advance by the CFR One World Money Group, end of quote. Of course, it didn't stop with this. A few decades later, in 1961, the United States introduced a program calling for all nations to transfer their military power to the UN. In other words, the UN would become the global entity. And that was kind of the first time that was decided, that the UN would become the government, the global government. In 1972, in Stockholm, Sweden, the Canadian Maurice Strong, he's still around, I think he lives in China now, became the director of the newly created UN Environmental Program, which took place at a UN conference on the environment in Stockholm. In 1976, in Vancouver, British Columbia, there was a conference on human settlements. And think about settlements, it kind of sounds benign to you, but to me, it sounds very Marxist, because when they settled us, they moved us from the country, they confiscating our land, and they moved us into concrete block apartments. And sometimes they thought that we might have too big of an apartment, they moved another family with us, and we had to share the bathroom and the kitchen. Anyway, so at this conference in 1976, they produced the first steps towards global governance, and the document was about 65 pages long, and it was all on land use, how land across the globe should be used according to their ideas. And what was the kind of the leitmotif of land use? It was public control of land use is indispensable. So the recommendations that appeared in this conference report are implemented in the US right now as sustainable development, which is the linchpin of Agenda 21. It is in your programs, if you have in your area, called Sustainable Communities or Smart Growth or Green Growth, as mandated by comprehensive land use plans. In 1983, the World Commission on the Environment, via the vice chair of the World Socialist Party, her name is Gro Harlem Brundtland, introduced the term and the definition of sustainable development. And again, it sounds very innocuous. I think few people would object to the definition, and it is. Sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Well, it sounds innocuous, but to me, it's collectivism 101. Who gets to decide what the needs are? And who gets to decide at what point you're compromising the ability of future generations, and what is the criteria you're going to use? In 1992, the UN Conference on Environment and Development, which was probably one of the largest conferences ever, it had 10,000 delegates and 30,000 NGOs, non-governmental organizations, in Rio, Brazil, and they produced 3 documents. One was UN Agenda 21. If you Google it, it's a kind of a yellow-looking book. It's got about almost 400 pages, 40 chapters, and it is a soft law, not a treaty. The Convention on Biological Diversity, which is a treaty, it has to be ratified, and it was. And the Framework Convention on Climate Change is also a treaty. How many people signed this document in '92? 178 countries, including the US. Our president at the time, George H.W. Bush, signed 2 of the 3 documents, but refused to sign the Convention on Biological Diversity because one of the stipulation, they had proprietary concerns about transfer of technology. It had to be done freely without any compensation, and that's just very uncapitalistic of them. UN Agenda 21 is a soft law document, was never ratified by Congress, but parts of it have been incorporated into other laws that were passed either because congressmen have not read the bills, imagine that, nor understood the huge ramifications and the full scope of Agenda 21. And this 40-chapter document limits the behavior and the freedoms not just of individuals like you and me, but companies as well, and it involves every facet of human life. They have not left anything out. I found a video dated October 2nd, 1982, from C-SPAN that shows discussion on the House floor about Agenda 21, in which both Democrats and Republicans are in favor of conforming fully to the recommendations of UN Agenda 21 document, in spite of the oath that they took to defend the US Constitution and our interests and the sovereignty of our country. And you can see a younger Nancy Pelosi actually introduced a bill to follow the 1992 Rio Earth Summit to conform to UN's Agenda 21, its local sustainable community practices, and to follow international law. And when I mentioned something like this in my book, I got a letter from President Bush's library saying that there's no such video where he promotes one world government, and I have the video. But anyway, I didn't argue with the lady. UN Agenda 21 makes suggestions and recommendations that are adapted into law at the state and local levels through, as I said, comprehensive land use plans, which are voted on and included by the Board of Supervisors into local zoning codes. Citizens do not understand its damaging ramifications to their private property and their ability to make a living farming, or to use their land, or grow food in their gardens, sell their fresh produce freely, and pretty much engage in agriculture. And I have a good friend in Virginia, Martha Bonetta, who bought a property about 8 years ago that's been sold as historical property because Stonewall Jackson was supposed to have bivouacked on the property, which was a lie. There's no historical document to pinpoint it exactly to her property, but because of that, she paid probably 2-3 times the value of the land, and it came with a conservation easement, and they gave her problems ever since, and we fought tooth and nail, and we passed 2 laws in Virginia, 2 Bonetta Bills 1 and 2, which give small farmers like her some protection from the intrusive local zoning people who just wanted to do sort of penny loafer farming, just have some beautiful grass, a few riding horses, and no growing of anything of vegetables or sheep or any animals that you might want on your property. And for 2 years, she could not use about 20 acres of her land where her poor cows couldn't even go in the shade under the trees to escape from the heat. So it's happening, of course, on different scales across the country. The late Henry Lamb, who's been fighting Agenda 21 for years, and then there's Mr. DeWeese, Tom DeWeese, who is still fighting it through American Policy Center. He said that government control of land use is a fundamental principle of global governance. Well, what are the stated goals of Agenda 21? One that scares me is population redistribution according to resources. So that kind of reminds me of communism, because everything we did, we had to do it according to the prescription of the centralized government, whether it was to go get a job on the top of the mountain after college, because that's where the need was, from confiscating your home, confiscating your belongings, and deeming you bourgeois because you may have a few extra possessions or an extra house or an extra parcel of land. So this population redistribution according to resources just gave me the creeps. Government control of land use in order to achieve equitable distribution of resources. Again, that's Communism 101. Land use control through zoning and planning. They're doing it all over the country, whether you know about it or not, and it's not in the interest of the people in the area. And they're so bold, as I found a document from 1998 in Montana, from the Park Service in Montana, telling farmers that they want to move them off the property because they don't want them to hunt or disturb the wildlife. And they were fighting the local representatives. Why are you not understanding that we're trying to help you? We're trying to save you money. We'll move them in the city, and the city has to worry about them, and you don't have to spend any money in the county. So under this guise, they were wanting to confiscate their properties, their land, in the country. And I was really upset about it, and I had to track down the representatives who are no longer there, and track down the newspaper editor and so forth, and they all confirmed what I had dug up. They want government control of excessive profits from land use. Again, that's a Marxist idea. They want urban and rural land control through public land ownership, and we already have these private-public partnerships springing up all over the country, and not just in reference of agricultural land, but even land for development of property or housing. Population control, and I don't know how they're going to achieve this, because if you look at various documents, different denizens of these environmentalists go anywhere. We're supposed to have ideally 500 million to 1 billion people. So how are they going to get rid of the rest of us? Attrition, famine, sterilization, I don't know. Developing rights must be held by public authorities via regionalist authorities. And I don't know if you know, but the United States is divided into 12 regions. And they call them FEMA regions, but they're actually regions recommended in the Agenda 21 document. Most recently, I found a video of Cristina Figueres. She is the president or secretary, I don't know her exact title, of the National UN Framework Convention on the Environment. And she's talking to a Northern California organization somewhere in San Francisco, and she's talking about moving rural populations into cities, into mega cities, not just any city, with mixed-use, high-rise, stack and pack, miniature apartments about the size of a coffin. It kind of terrorized me when I saw it, with no parking, but easy walking distance from work or school, entertainment, whatever, because it is easier to control the population if they're densely into one locale as opposed to spread out all over the country. And she was talking about that these mega cities are going to be self-sustainable. I hate this word sustainable now, because everything has to be sustainable. It's a nice word, but because it has such control connotations. So she said that the buildings had to capture rainwater And with this rainwater, it would be enough for all the people living in these mega cities, and they would grow vegetables and food on terraces and on the roof. And the same terraces and roof would have solar panels. She didn't say anything about windmills. I think it was all solar panels. I don't know where they would put all this stuff and how they would produce all the food necessary and the water necessary for all the inhabitants on such a mega city. It would be actually a lot worse to bring so many people together in terms of pollution. Then they're talking about mass transit with a light rail and removing people from their cars by making roads too expensive via tolls and no parking garages. And they already have such apartments in California that are very, very small, and they don't even have elevators. People have to walk up and down the stairs. And I remember that because we lived on the 5th floor in Romania, and we didn't have an elevator. And we were all very thin because we were equally miserable, equally tired, equally hungry, but we were equal. When I take the now forcibly toll road on the HOV lanes that we paid with taxpayer dollars, I have to pay $27 to go 8 miles. And to me, that's highway robbery. And of course, as an economist, it's an incentive to remove us off the road to take public transportation. We're not there yet, as in Japan, where they kind of shove you into the metro cars. But I do remember in communism when they shoved us on buses like sardines, and sometimes there were holes on the floorboard of the bus, and we could get the fumes, going inside, and we could see the road running at 5 miles an hour, and it took forever to get wherever you wanted to go. As you know, currently, HUD is redrawing neighborhoods to make them more diverse because we're not diverse enough. In DC, we have about 225 different nationalities, and on my street is like the UN. I'm the only one who flies the American flag. Everybody else is flying their country's flag wherever they're from. It is now in Seattle, according to the Seattle Mayor Ed Murray, it is social injustice to own a single family house. So they're trying to ban single family zoning in Seattle, and that involves anybody who would have a 5,000 square foot lot. I was shocked about that, but not surprised. It is Seattle after all. But it's going to come probably to your neighborhoods later on. Oh yeah, I remember Ms. Figueres, who, by the way, has a degree from London School of Economics, very important degree. She delivered the speech to the World Affairs Council of Northern California. I don't know who runs that outfit, but it's somewhere in San Francisco. And she was touting at this speech that the world has reinvented itself. We have to reinvent government, and we pretty much have done that already. We're way on our way in the United States. We are reinventing government at different levels. She attempted to convince all the mayors in the world that these mega cities represent efficiency and prosperity for all. And my mouth was kind of dropping listening to this. I don't see the efficiency and I don't see the prosperity. All I see is oppression and control, oppression and control. The Business Insider had an article not long ago about the plan that floated a Davos conference they had this year, where they were talking about spending $90 trillion to redesign all cities so that people no longer would need cars. And she said, quote, in order to address climate change, is to build a complex framework, the purpose of which is to facilitate and accelerate the actions at all different levels of government, end of quote. What actions is she talking about? Oh, the sky's the limit, you name it. I suppose in a UN-dominated world, a global government would know best, right? So they would be able to pick and choose whatever actions they deem necessary because they know it all. I mean, I've lived under such a totalitarian system. Sustainable transportation and coffins are going to be stacked, I presume, by the millions in these mega cities. If you have time, Google this video and you'll be flabbergasted. How are you going to grow food on roofs and terraces? I'm trying to grow food in a garden, and the deer, the rabbits, everybody's eating my stuff. And I can't put enough fences because the HOA, another arm of Agenda 21, is not letting us. My neighbor had to get permission from us in writing that they can build a deck onto their house. You don't think that's control? It is. I don't understand why Americans ever agreed to HOAs. And I don't buy that, oh, it just keeps up property values. How? Explain it to me economically, how the fact that George put pink flamingos in his yard that can be removed, how is that going to affect the value of my house? But anyway, that's another conversation. Figueres said, quote, "You will enjoy unlimited interaction and global cooperation," end of quote. Really? What kind of interaction? Whenever you water your plants and the water comes down onto my balcony, or how's that going to happen? And global cooperation? She said that the buildings will capture as much water needed for the food grown on roofs and terraces of the building, end of quote. I'm still not, I don't understand where this woman is coming from, and she's educated at the London School of Economics. And so the question was, what would be the benefits of living in such mega cities? And I asked the question of, I didn't get their permission to use their name, but I asked them what would be the benefits. They're obviously one of these environmental wackos. He said that we're going to avoid the catastrophic rise in temperatures. Okay, never mind the polar vortex that dumped records amount of snow and froze half of the globe. Even Cairo got snow, if I recall. And every time they try to meet about global warming, they were either frozen or snowed in. But this guy said we're going to have increased food security. Well, this is absolutely madness because I've researched that all the grain stored in the world can only last for 2 days in a case of a worldwide catastrophe. So how is that going to be feeding us a few plants on the terrace or on your balcony? He said, oh, you're going to have increased energy security. Really? How so? Solar panels, they still need conventional electricity when there's no sun. Windmills need conventional electricity to run. They cost, maintenance is high. You have to keep all those things oiled. Just because they spin, that doesn't mean they're producing electricity. They operate, I think, ideally when the wind is like 33 miles per hour. So I'm not buying that. Increased water security from collecting rainwater, really? Okay. Transportation security using electric cars with charge stations. We have quite a few of those in DC. I've never seen anybody charging their cars at those stations, ever. And besides, where's this electricity coming from? Is it not coming from burning coal? Well, he also said that the low-carbon model contributes to job creation. What jobs? These green jobs don't really exist. They just renamed any kind of job green job. I haven't seen any. Job security? I don't think so. And happiness. I don't know. I look in the cities, I don't see anybody smiling. They actually look weird at you if you smile or say hello. Safeguards natural resources for future generations. Would there be future generations? Because if you look at the demographics in the developed nations of the world, they're like 0.9 babies per family. They're not even a 2.1 replacement value. So pretty much Europe is committing suicide. The only reason we are at 2.1 is because we have all the illegal immigration and all the anchor babies, et cetera, et cetera. So, will there be future generations? Perhaps, but not from the developed world. And my question is, what future generation, if we live in those mega cities, would that be before or after mass starvation? We'll see. But here's another point to this Agenda 21 Shangri-La mega city living. You have driverless cars. Wow, there will be a black box in every vehicle, and I found out that the guy who suggested the idea of having black boxes in every vehicle is a former KGB, a Russian guy. Makes sense. Manipulation of humans who suddenly don't have to do anything. You just sit there and you're kind of compliant and drone-like. And you're shopping on your iPads. That was Christina Figueres' suggestion. Oh, you can go shopping on your iPads. I don't even want to shop now, much less on the iPad. So it's just another way to dumb down a person's education, because don't tell me just because you can manipulate technology and type really fast and know how to retrieve information, that makes you really smart. I don't think so. There are certain things that you can learn through memorization, experience, and hands-on, not going to Google and looking something up very quickly. I find that as technology has improved in the late 90s, the quality of students I've had declined. And their retention of information and comprehension and ability to read had declined as well. So, are we going to be able to produce all the electricity that we need in these mega cities just with their kumbaya renewables? I don't think so. Our economy is too large to have all this electricity. Yes, individually, perhaps you can produce it for your house, and as the prices of solar panels come down, I think it's a good idea to have solar panels on your house. There's nothing wrong with that idea. But for the economy, unless, of course, the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is also part of Agenda 21, goes through, is ratified, and in that case, we're going to become just a service economy. Whatever is left of our manufacturing is going to go away to all the other 11 signatories of TPP, and there you have it. We'll have just a service economy. So maybe we'll have enough electricity then because we won't be manufacturing anything. I mentioned earlier conservation easements. How many of you know what that is or have heard of it? Okay. They're also called conservation covenants or agricultural easement, and I actually researched the latest data from Ohio, all the acres, and they have quite an extensive conservation easement around in that area. They exist in all of the 50 states, or is it 57 states? I forgot to ask. Just kidding. 50 states, and it's basically a contract between a landowner and an NGO, a land trust, a non-governmental organization that receives matching funds from the government, and they buy the rights to tell you what to do on your property, either for 9 years, 10 years, or in perpetuity, depending how greedy you are or needy for money at the moment. And I don't know of many farmers who don't need money continuously. So when somebody offers you $500,000, you're going to take it, not thinking about down the road consequences. And sometimes they're pretty onerous because they come and inspect your property frequently to make sure that you are compliant with the terms of the contract, which are, by the way, secret. They're only known between the grantor and the grantee. And it runs with the land. So if you sell the land, the person who buys it, and that was the case of my friend, buys the conservation easement as well. And you have to abide by these rules. And I found that in the state of Ohio, for example, on page 18, the deed for the federal government of the conservation easement says, quote, to have and to hold the above described agricultural easement to the use, benefit, and behalf of the grantees and the United States and their successors and assigns forever, end of quote. How would you like to be that farmer who wants to leave their land to their children? The local sponsor or applicant that pays for the conservation easement contract can be a municipal corporation, or it can be a county or a township. It can be a soil and water conservation district, or it can be a charitable organization that applies for a matching grant on behalf of the farmer. The problem arises from the fact that soil and water now are taking the place of elected officials, or a charitable trust or an environmental trust are also not elected officials, so they become that shadow government, so to speak. They're just land brokers working for the state government as so-called sponsor. Well, that's a big problem, and I think farmers should think twice before they sign such a conservation easement. In the case of my friend Martha, and there's actually her YouTube video still up online, they came and demanded to inspect her closets. She had a barn where people got together and had parties, and there was stoves to cook, and there was a closet to put your muddy boots and whatever and clothes, and they wanted to inspect her closet. How intrusive. The environmental impact statements, and I read the one coming from Montana, it actually stated point blank that it had plans to manipulate human populations into rural areas, end of quote. And that was really scary. How many of you know of Dr. Kaufman Wallen's project map? You've seen it online? Yes? Okay, he developed it in accordance with Agenda 21, with the biological diversity, the NAFTA treaty, and other treaties. And if you look at it, it shows in various colors where human habitation will be allowed, where corridors of passage will be allowed, where the military bases will be allowed, and the areas where there will be no trespassing, no humans, nothing, it's all wildlife. And those areas are the largest part of the United States, so it's pretty scary. This man was very remarkable because he stopped the passage of the document an hour before by presenting this map they had developed. How many of you have heard of the law of the Sea Treaty, which is part of Agenda 21? Lots of people. The acronym is LOST, L-O-S-T. If this is ever ratified, and it was presented 4 times, last time under Mr. Kerry, it will give UN total control of all the territorial and oceanic waters in the world, including passage, whether you want to, it's your military or commercial passage, whether you're doing underwater mineral and fossil fuel explorations and so forth. And of course, the UN would have their own bank, and everybody will have to give them a percentage of any kind of mineral rights or passage fees or whatever, and they would have a court that would settle all the disputes between countries, individual corporations, or individuals who might happen to sell their yacht in that area. And of course, they would also control all the straits passage through various straits. So can you imagine that? The implications are really scary. President Bill Clinton facilitated President Bush's initial commitment to Agenda 21 by signing an executive order which created the President's Council on Sustainable Development, and the goal of this council was to translate Agenda 21 into public policy under the guise of ecosystem management. Those of you who have ever visited in Virginia, there's a county called Loudoun County in Virginia, and they already have areas where people can buy homes, very expensive home, and it's located in such an ecosystem management. When you build it, you have to agree to all these medieval standards. The only thing I like about it, you have solar panels, but they're on thatched roofs. I don't think I want to spend $800,000 to in excess of $1 million to live in a thatched roof house. I'm scared a cat might fall through, but anyway. The One World governance harmonizes with every country in the world in relation to environmental protection, racial justice, equality and social justice, and these are just kind of quote code words for redistribution of wealth, of course, and they also promote health as a human right. And you know, I grew up under communism, and we did have socialized medicine, and it was a right. It was your right to go see any butcher you wanted and wait all day. You got a prescription, and then you went to the pharmacy and the shelves were empty. So just because you had insurance and you had the right to go see a doctor for free, that doesn't mean you got medical care. And most people were killed doing simple operations like a tonsillectomy. They cut your vocal cords, or they nipped your voice box, or if you had you know, other simple surgery that you take for granted here, you died, you gangrene because they clipped something, your colon or whatever. So a lot of people prayed a lot and paid lots of bribes and hoped for the best, and then they still died. And it hasn't changed that much. I was in Romania about 2 months ago, and my cousin, who is 42 and an engineer, she cried for 30 days before she decided to have an appendectomy because she just knew she was going to die. And I watched her pray all night the night before. She thought she was going to die. And so things haven't changed that much. And it cost her, let's see, everything was supposed to be free, but she bribed the doctor 1,000 euros. She bribed the nurse and the anesthetist. So she was about 3,000 euros shorter in the bank account after this free medicine. Harvey Rubin, the vice chair of ICLEI. How many of you have heard of ICLEI? I-C-L-E-I. Okay, the International Council for Local Environmental Initiative, which is the arm of implementing Agenda 21. It is now called Local Governments for Sustainability, because once different locales caught on to their goal, they started kicking them out. So to prevent this being kicked out, they changed their names. And they said, this Harvey Rubin said that individual rights must take a back seat to the collective, end of quote. What are they supposed to control through this Agenda 21? Well, you name it: energy production, energy delivery, energy distribution, consumption via smart grids, smart meters, renewables. How many of you have smart meters in your home? Okay, well, we have an opt-out in Virginia, but some dopes in Maryland. They took $100 bribes, and they had those installed willingly about 6 or 7 years ago. And we went to visit some friends, and it was stifling hot in their house. And what's wrong? Well, we have smart meters, and they cut our power off for 8 hours every day because it's peak consumption, and they don't want to store any excess capacity because it's too expensive to build the storage. And this way, they just control your consumption. They just cut it off. They're going to control your food growth and production via onerous FDA regulations. They're going to control your education via a curriculum that's centered around Mother Earth and global citizenship. If you look at Maryland, they passed a law about 3 years ago called No Child Left Inside Act. In order to graduate from high school, you had to have environmental literacy. But I looked at their math scores and readings, and they were just dismal. How many of you know about the International Baccalaureate schools? We have about 2,000 of them in Virginia. They come from a private company in Geneva, Switzerland, and it's just another fancy way of promoting the same curriculum as Common Core, where there's very little history taught, and the curriculum is secret, very little government, math, science. It's mostly all these kumbaya environmental type of classes, social justice, and so forth. And they're trying to divorce their children from being an American. And they've made their way all the way into Romania. I've noticed that there was a lot of decay of museums and things of national pride, and I asked them why, and they said, well, we're no longer teaching history, Romanian history. We're teaching this European Union-directed type of global history for global citizenship, so I was shocked. And they have to do it because they have accepted a lot of money from the EU. The Agenda 21 is going to control your water through irrigation denial to save the fish, as in the case of your Delta smelt in California. They're going in your home use. There are smart meters on your water meter, on your gas meter. They're going to control your recreation activities, and they're already or have destructed quite a few dams and reservoirs, and I noticed some of your reservoirs here in California were empty. Population control, I saw some quotes even by Jacques Cousteau that shocked me. God rest his soul. I used to worship him because I liked watching nature stuff, and he said, you know, that if we have to kill a few million, so be it, to save the planet. He talked about manageable levels of population control and who decides and how. And obviously you're familiar with various eugenicists and eugenic organizations in our country. No borders, no sovereignty. That's one of the tenets in Agenda 21. No national language and culture. You have just a multicultural hodgepodge. The longer distance will be done through light rail use, right? You will have mobility restrictions. When I was growing up, I don't think we went past 60 kilometers around where we were born our entire lives. If we did, we were extremely lucky. Either that or we were able to jump the border or swam across the Danube, whichever. Here are some things that Agenda 21 deems not sustainable. Well, pretty much everything that defines our Western civilization, private property, fossil fuels, consumerism, farming, irrigation, commercial agriculture, pesticides, herbicides, farmland, grazing your livestock, paved roads, golf courses, ski lodges, logging, dams, reservoirs, fences, power lines, suburban living, and the family unit. And I have seen in the Washington Compost a lot of, Washington Post, I've seen a lot of articles lately where they're saying that Americans no longer like to live in suburbia. They just want to live downtown where things are happening. And they just don't like to have a family anymore. They just like to live, you know, in interesting combinations. Really? And they're promoting these articles week after week, and it just nauseates me, but I have to read them so I can keep up with what the enemy is doing. According to my friend, late Henry Lamb, UNESCO, which is another tentacle of the United Nations, had taught seminars to teachers and disseminated curriculum materials that promoted the idea that nationalism was bad and had to be replaced with global citizenship. As a matter of fact, I went to my local high school to see some of these international baccalaureate textbooks for myself, and I was told that I couldn't unless I had a child enrolled in the program. But I did find out that they were spending about $8,000 per teacher to train them, and this money per year. And this money was coming from the budget that was supposed to be used to teach our children in general. So I was talking to my daughter the other day about that, and she was telling me how she had tutored a child who was involved in the Common Core curriculum, and she was not allowed to choose her literary piece to write a report on. She was told to go use some easy, cheesy contemporary writer because it would be easier to read. You're just not smart enough for Charlotte Bronte. You have to read something modern. But anyway, so this international baccalaureate kind of plants the seeds of prejudice against your national pride, against your Americanism, and supports the idea that global citizenship is the way to go, and so is the world governance, because they are the only viable solutions to the future of a socially, racially, and economically unjust planet. And well, I asked the principal, what if I have a child and I want to enroll him or her in this program? And he said, well, first the child has to be enrolled for at least a year before we make the transition, and we have to determine whether they're mentally prepared for this program. Really, it's very little math, very little science, no American government, no history, just European history, social justice, environmental curriculum, stuff like that. So I did find out some things from people who actually had their children in the program, and that's how we know the little information we know about them. And some high schools managed to vote them out because they ran out of money, simply. My daughter was joking that they were saved, both my daughters were saved in the South because it was this pre-Common Core, and she said, well, they were so poor in the South they couldn't afford to buy up-to-date books, so we were good. We were still taught from old books from 20 years ago. Because we were talking, how did you turn out, both of you turn out to be conservatives? Because my son kind of straddles the fence. He's only 25, his brain is not fully developed yet. Sorry. It's true. Isn't that physiologically true? They kind of stop developing at 25, am I right? Am I wrong? Okay, I'll correct myself next time. But the worst thing that a lot of people don't know, and I put it in my book on page 29, does it take, yeah, 29, I don't want to tell you wrong. There's an actual UN's Environmental Constitution for the World. The acronym is DICED, as in chopping, D-I-C-E-D. I love these acronyms. It's called, it stands for Draft International Covenant on Environment and Development. I read, yeah, covenant, don't you love that word? The version I read, which was issued on September 22nd, 2010, was written to control all development tied to the environment. As they say, the highest form of law for all human activity, end of quote. It has 79 articles, so it is like a constitution, and it was 242 pages. I told you I read a lot of garbage in order to learn about this Agenda 21. But in these 242 pages, there are 79 articles that take the sustainable development principles described in the Agenda 21 document, the 40 chapters, and transform them into global law, which supersedes all constitutions of the world, including the US Constitution. And if you think this is not serious, think again, because it's being implemented as we speak. Now, all signatory nations would become centrally planned socialist countries in which all decisions would be made within the framework of sustainable development of the 40-chapter document. And here's a quote. Agenda 21 proposes an array of actions which are intended to be implemented by every person on earth. It calls for specific changes in the activities of all people. Effective execution of Agenda 21 will require a profound reorientation of all humans, unlike anything the world has ever experienced, end of quote. And Mrs. Figueres kind of let the cat out of the bag about 2 months ago when she said that Agenda 21, its main goal is really to destroy capitalism, plain and simple. And there's a quote about that, you can look it up. I mentioned earlier that President Bill Clinton issued an executive order number 12858 in 1995, which directed all the federal government to work with the state and local governments in a joint effort to, quote unquote, reinvent government using the guidelines in Agenda 21. And so now every town, county, and state now have a sustainable development plan in the works. And of course, also every federal agency has a sustainable development program or anything associated with the federal government that receives funds from the federal government. Even the Army has sustainable development plans. Sierra Club, Nature Conservancy, National Audubon Society, National Historical Preservation, Scenic America receive millions of dollars from the federal government to fund cleverly designed schemes to stop land development, shutting down land and roads to human use, to hunting, to building, to access and to acquire more land and national heritage sites around the country. You saw when we were at the Jet Propulsion Lab that it is a historic site. Since 1985, there was a little sign close to the floor on a door. That's just, it's not just to preserve its historical significance, but you can, essentially you can't do anything to the land, and it falls under UNESCO guidance. It's not under US government guidance. It falls under UNESCO, under UN. I'll give you another example of this conservation gone amok heritage site. There are 15 counties in Virginia that are preserved for music. It's called Virginia's Historic Music Trail. Why do you need 15 counties? Because they already have these auditoriums where you can go and play bluegrass all you want all day long. The entire city of Baltimore is preserved. Okay, they can have it. The entire state of Tennessee, Florida, Colorado, Iowa, West Virginia, most of Virginia, just to name a few. J. Gary Lawrence, advisor to President Clinton's Council on Sustainable Development, said, quote, participating in a UN-advocated planning process would very likely bring out many of the conspiracy-fixated groups and individuals in our society. This segment of our society who fear one world government and a UN invasion of the United States through which individual freedom would be stripped away, would actively work to defeat any elected officials who joined the conspiracy by undertaking Agenda 21. So we call our process something else, such as comprehensive planning, growth management, or smart growth, end of quote. So, well, I have been called many times that I had a tinfoil hat. Well, I'm sorry, if you had time to read all the garbage I read, you'd have a tinfoil hat as well. Even Pope Francis, sorry Catholics, delivered his encyclical on climate change, and I read it in Italian because I do speak Italian fluently, and I found many similar quotes in his, probably 2/3 of his speech, that were lifted from Agenda 21, and some of them were changed slightly. Now, towards the end, he had a couple or maybe 3 prayers, so that gave it kind of a religious connotation. But having His Holiness support the goals of the climate change industry kind of gives the entire agenda a new and very powerful facade. And he is coming to address Congress. Why? Whatever happened to that divorce between church and state? I found Agenda 21 in many other places, and they are in my book. Now, if you take into account the complexity of Agenda 21 and the encroachment around the globe, it will kind of take a miracle to dismantle it. I found Agenda 21 in Romania. I was in this really dilapidated building that we used to live in, and they had a brand new bank of smart meters. There were about 17 of them on the wall. And everybody in the building complained of arthritis, and they had tinnitus, and they had burning on the surface of their skin, and they couldn't sleep. They had insomnia, they had tachycardia, and they all had the same symptoms, and they were all treated by the same doctor, and nobody knew why they're so sick. And after I interviewed several people in the building, it kind of coincided their symptoms with the placement of these smart meters. So I told them to buy some copper plates to kind of protect themselves a little bit. I don't know. I'll have to find out if it worked on my next visit. So Agenda 21 is everywhere. I'm not sure that we can extricate ourselves from it because it's so far gone. It might need God's miracle. God's miracle. Let's pray for that. Questions? Thank you.
Number one, I'm sorry we were making a lot of noise, only because we were cheering you the whole way. Everything was so consonant with what we agreed with that we couldn't help ourselves, and I apologize for that because we didn't want to interrupt you, but your speech
you guys
was great.
had a beer or two too many.
No, martinis. But listen, everything. Let me tell you about just the last point you made was about the Pope and his encyclical Laudato Si. He has an advisor. I just want to agree with you about this, named Hans Schellenhuber, and he has publicly proposed the gross transformation, the grand transformation of humanity into a one-world government. This was in Der Spiegel and other Zeitschrift magazines and so forth. Publicly pronounce these kind of things, and his fingerprints are on the encyclical, as you mentioned. He mentioned these very things. And the Pontifical Academy of Science and Social Sciences just had a conference where they had all these world mayors and the Governor Jerry Brown of California and so forth, right, where they endorsed publicly. You sound like a crazy conspiracy theorist when you talk about it, just as you said. But they endorsed the United Nations the Sustainable Development Procedures. And the very first thing that they say is to implement Agenda 21. I mean, that's through their own words, their own thing. It sounds like a nutty thing. I mean, you can comment on it if you like, but we're just very grateful to you. I mean, I know we were making a lot of noise about it, but we wanted to cheer every statement that you were making.
Okay.
So thank you for being so public about it.
One thing I did not mention to you was that all these funds that would become controlled by the United Nations would be deposited with the World Bank. So, and they would also facilitate the allocation of land use as well. They will determine how you will be using your land, whether
Well-
you like it or not.
Okay, well, that's what I wanted to talk about. I'm one of the people that were making noise back here. But, you know, I'm from the Midwest. I don't know what you guys in Virginia are doing. I don't know what people in California or New York are doing. But I'm going to tell you, in the Midwest, like my great-grandfather, he homesteaded that land. He broke up the sod. He was a dirt-poor Iowa farmer. And we're not giving up our land. We're all armed. And somebody from the London School of Economics can come all she wants to. We are not, exactly, Mullan lobby. We're all armed and we're not giving up our land. And this whole, you know, they say in the military that the first shot of a war, the plans all go out the window. Okay, these idiots in Washington, D.C. and the London School of Economics can talk all the shit they want to, and I'm sorry to use this word, but that's what it is. They don't know where their calories come from. They don't know where their food comes from. You do. You're from Romania. You know what this is about. You know, farmers have a different perspective on things. We know where our food comes from, and we're not giving up our land. So yeah, they might win, but we're not going to go down easy. And I'm just going to let you know that the revolution, if it doesn't start in Virginia, it's going to start in Iowa and the Midwest. End of story. Because we know about Agenda 21, and everybody, I don't care, everybody with a high school education in Iowa knows about Agenda 21, and what you said is so profound. I mean, it was just so hard listening to it because everything you said was so right. But you know what? It's just not going to work because ultimately freedom prevails, and I believe in that. Yeah. Hoorah.
She's not always like this. Sometimes she gets really excited. But I wanted to share a thought with you. When that scribe from the Compost wrote whatever he wrote, I would have considered a ring of truth in it if he said that Americans don't want to be free anymore. And well, that's the problem, I think. But I would like to also add that the virtues of giving, which are at the root of this whole collectivist, socialist, communist thing, are not virtues if there is no freedom to do it or not do it. And that is a very strong logical axiom to me. They want us to give up freedom under the guise of giving to those who need. What's wrong with this picture, logically? Sorry, that's...
Well, most people are not voluntarily altruistic, and they just don't like supporting someone who sits down and does nothing all day long. Yeah, I'll tell you, under communism, they pretended to pay us and we pretended to work. That's how well it worked. And we did involuntary volunteer work. You know.
Several years ago, I read a book by a fellow named Michael Parenti. It was a required book in some sections of a required course in the university. I read the entire book and realized that there was only one error in the whole book. I read very few books that I could say that. The problem was that every last sentence in that book was based on that error. The book was talking about the moral advantages of socialism versus the evils of capitalism. The idea in this book is very, very simple and very crucial. And it's a very simple idea that as a moral ideal in all economic exchanges, both parties should receive equal value. Now, certainly you don't want one party to gain, the other one to lose. What you get under freedom is if there's going to be a deal, both parties expect to gain. You give up what you value less to get what you value more, but that's true of both parties. This, because I happened to read this book and find out it was all based on this, I realized this is the taproot of all leftist ideology. You're not going to convince the hardcore leftists. You don't have to. You have to keep them from infecting everybody else. It's this simple. The private sector is based on, I'll do something good for you if you'll do something good for me. Now, what's a corollary of the idea that both parties should come out equal? There will never be a Henry Ford or a Bill Gates or a Steve Jobs. In other words, no matter how much you exchange, you should wind up equal. So all you rich boys around here are evil. Now, this is a subtle thing, but this is where you get the hate the rich business. This is where you get social justice. But if you think about it as both parties gain, the way you become rich if you're not working, an advantage of the government or you're not engaging in theft, is by doing favors for other people. And of course, they did a favor for you. So the more favors you do, the richer you get. I did fairly well. Bill Gates, that's so-and-so, did much better. But he interacted with billions of people. I did not. This question of equal exchange is at the heart of all their ideas. Look at everything you see from them and trace it back, reverse engineer it, and it will wind up there, usually.
Thank you.
Just a quick question on, about 40 years ago, this fellow by the name of Paul Ehrlich came around, and we still hear his idiotic ideas. None of this ZPG or any of the things he predicted. Where does he fit into this proposed Agenda 21 and all that other stuff?
Oh,
You
he's a big supporter of Agenda 21, of population control, eugenics, you name it. He's out there. Yeah. And I think he's still around here in California at Stanford, I believe.
I just want everybody to know that, in a few days, probably, the EPA's Clean Power Plan will be their final regulation recommendation is going to be released. Rumor is it'll be worse than the proposed regulation. And I'm from Arizona, and Arizona got hit with a 52% reduction in carbon dioxide emissions, and we have only about 30% coal-fired generation. The rest is nuclear and gas. Some states have 90% or 95% coal-fired generation. We got slammed, and there's no way, physically, any way, scientifically, you can make it work in Arizona unless you close every plant. Well, I belong to a rural electric cooperative. That's all we have for power in all the rural outreaches of Arizona is one power plant down in Wilcox, Arizona. Things are heavy. Some states have said they're going to opt out. They're not going to do it. We're trying to comply because the federal implementation plans are worse than the state ones usually. And so things are happening, and they're happening really fast in this nation. And by the way, since you live in Washington, D.C., did you know that the whole Capitol Hill complex is powered by a coal-fired generator?
Yeah.
I may be one of the few people in this room who's lived during a period of subsistence farming. I'm 85. I lived in western North Carolina, which was kind of backward. And I want to address this one issue you mentioned about people are going to a big apartment complex in one of these mega cities is going to grow enough food to sustain themselves. That's a pipe dream. That's a fantasy. I mean, the people I knew that raised their vegetables in a huge garden that was almost as big as this room, because you had to have, for the winter time, you had to have your root crops. You had to have beets and carrots and potatoes, of course, lots of potatoes, and the rest of the food for the summertime. You had to have room for that. So you can just imagine splitting up this room into all these little plots. But the families were on the average of what, 6, 7 people, mother, father, and 4 or 5 kids or more. And so they're going to sustain themselves. They'd get a few tomatoes for 1 or 2 days a year, and then where does the solar panels go?
That's true.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. Johnson.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.